Hi, I'm Danny Dubois, and I'm doing the topic analysis for the UNT topic, resolved in the United States, private ownership of handguns ought to be banned. I think this topic's very relevant. As most people know, in Charleston last week, a shooter brought a small handgun and killed 9 people in what was one of the worst mass shootings in recent history, along the lines of what happened in Sandy Hook and Aurora, where there's consistent gun violence. But one unique thing about this shooting compared to other shootings is that it wasn't committed with an assault weapon or with a weapon that was complex in any way. It was just a small handgun, and though reports somewhat conflict, most people think the gun was legally bought, so there was very little that gun laws could have done short of an outright ban on guns. But on the other hand, we have other situations where we see the need for guns. For example, in New Jersey, Carol Brown tried to buy a handgun, fearing for her safety. However, because New Jersey has a 2-month license application, she had to wait to receive that gun, and in that period, she was murdered by her ex-boyfriend. So in this topic analysis, I'm going to do 3 things. First, I'm going to talk about a brief background on the current state of gun control policy. Secondly, we can talk about what affirmatives will look like. And thirdly, we can go over what negatives will look like. I think the topic in terms of what it's asking is very simple. Right now it's legal to own a handgun for self-defense, and the first major case in the Supreme Court to establish this was D.C. v. Heller in 2008. So some people make the argument that the Second Amendment as it's worded says that people in a civilian militia can own arms, but that means that there isn't really a right to bear arms because people aren't in the militia. Well, this case in D.C. v. Heller interpreted the Second Amendment to say that it also allows people to legally own handguns in their homes for the purpose of self-defense, striking down a ban that Washington, D.C. had on handguns. So basically, the debate is similar to the debate that was had in D.C. v. Heller and whether people have a right to own handguns. The current gun law landscape is a little bit disappointing. Right now, 88 people die from firearm deaths every day. It's very easy to buy a gun. In most states, you can get one at a gun show without a background check. So right now, the way it works is if you want to buy a gun at a dealer, also known as a federal firearms license, or an FFL, you have to go through a background check in which the FBI runs you through their NICS database, and they'll check for things like whether you have a felony conviction, whether you have a drug conviction, whether you are a fugitive from justice, and if you meet one of those categories, you don't have access to the gun. But the way the law was written in the early 1990s is that it didn't apply to private sales, so one person selling his personally owned gun to another, and it also didn't apply to guns sold at gun shows, which means that people who have these felony convictions and don't have access to guns can very easily get one. There are also legal loopholes so that people can legally buy a gun even though we would think they shouldn't have one. So a couple of examples are, right now, many states don't bar people who have domestic violence convictions in dating relationships from owning guns. The law's written so it's something along the lines of domestic violence with someone that was like a spouse they lived with. Also, people with stalking misdemeanors are frequently still able to buy guns, and people on the FBI's terror watch list, so the list that prevents you from owning from going on a plane, those people can still legally buy a gun as long as they don't have one of the other disqualifiers, like being a felon or something. So it was so bad that, in fact, Al-Qaeda sent a video to its members saying that they should go to the United States to buy guns because those guns are so easy to buy. The problem is that it's very hard to pass gun legislation. So, following the Sandy Hook shooting in December 2012, Obama made a very big push to pass things like universal background checks and an assault weapons ban. But the issue is that the NRA lobby is so strong, and especially in states that aren't on the coast, so like in the South and in the West, people care very much about the guns issue. So, even something simple like people should get background checks couldn't pass a democratically controlled Senate. The instance of a law that's probably the most similar to the topic that existed on a national level was the assault weapons ban passed in Bill Clinton's 1994 bill. This lasted until 2004, and the research on it is unclear, but the indications are that the law didn't really work because it didn't stop people who already had assault weapons, so they were still able to commit violence. And this is why currently a lot of prominent gun organizations, like the one I'm currently working for, actually don't push for assault weapons bans anymore. The organizing principle isn't no guns, but rather keep guns away from bad guys. So, along those lines, Bill Clinton passed this bill in 1994, and then in the midterm elections, the Democrats had one of their worst losses to date. And since then, gun control had been considered the third rail of American politics, something that people shouldn't try to address for fear of how people would react. So now let's discuss what affirmatives would look like. I think it's very clear that the AF defends a ban on handguns, and all AFs, regardless of whether they're plan AFs or principal AFs, will have to be clear about a couple of things. First is the definition of handguns. This has also been a problem in laws that have tried to ban assault weapons, is defining what that exactly means. So for example, currently black powder pistols aren't considered legal firearms because they're considered antiques, and recently in Virginia, a woman was murdered by an ex-boyfriend who was a felon, but he could still buy this antique firearm because it wasn't technically considered a firearm subject to a background check. You also have to wonder, do you have some type of retrieval mechanism to collect the guns that people already have? So there are buyback programs in Boston where the police will just tell people to bring in guns and they will give them money in return. You could have something like requiring people to register weapons but still grandfathering the weapons into the ban so people can still own them. Or you could have some method where you try to force people to turn the guns in. There are several different advantages people can talk about when they're affirmative and talking about guns. So the first is gun deaths. Over 88 people die per day due to gun violence, and guns make that much more likely. So guns are also used in about 50% of suicides, but that's only because they're more lethal. In fact, most suicide attempts are due to things like drug overdoses, but those methods aren't as lethal on a first attempt. There's a lot of evidence that says that guns are uniquely problematic in this phenomenon because people who are suicidal might only be suicidal for a short amount of time, and if they use a method that is not likely to be as lethal, then they can recover from their situation, whereas with guns there's often no turning back. A second important thing AFs can talk about is gun trafficking. In fact, recently Mexico has actually complained about how lax gun laws are in the United States because they've helped armed drug cartels, because it's very easy through things like gun shows to get a large amount of guns and to be able to arm people that shouldn't be able to actually do that. A third issue to discuss is domestic violence. Guns have made domestic violence deaths very, very lethal. Recently, the organization I work for, Center for American Progress, released a report called Women Under the Gun, where they analyzed the prevalence of domestic violence and how people were able to cause a lot of harm through firearms. In fact, I think the statistic is that more women have died from intimate partner violence with a firearm than all the soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. A fourth potential thing people can talk about when they're affirming is terrorism. So as I said earlier, Al-Qaeda actually released a video saying terrorists should buy guns in the United States because it's so easy to do so. You can be on the no-fly list for terrorism and still be allowed to legally purchase a gun. And the Government Accountability Office recently reported that hundreds of terrorists have actually done that based on who was on the list and who they saw apply for a gun. Finally, if you want to go a more critical route, you could talk about the nature of U.S. gun culture and how it's often connected to white masculinity. A lot of criticisms have analyzed the U.S. in terms of like its culture of guns and how that came from westward expansion. So that's another interesting route you can go as well. I think some common issues affirmatives are going to have to deal with. There are two primary ones. One is not so smart and the other is smart. So the not so smart thing that affirmatives are going to have to deal with is people who are just like, you only ban firearms, people can still buy assault weapons, and that's problematic. I don't think this is a very good argument for negs to make, but it's a lot of things, it's like a lot of what people had as their first reaction to the topic. So the first problem with this argument is it's just defense. Like, even if the affirmative doesn't solve an assault weapons violence, like, the negative doesn't either, and there's still a large amount of violence that comes from handguns. The second thing is it's also not true. While assault weapons are commonly used in mass shootings, those are very rare, and the vast majority of gun violence comes from things like handguns and crime on the streets, etc., that people have to be aware of. And then thirdly, you can just talk about the unique problems that apply to handguns that don't apply to other weapons. So for example, handguns can be easily concealed, and a cop is going to notice if you're walking around the city with like a big assault weapon, but the cop isn't necessarily going to notice if you have a handgun in your bag. Then smart negatives will try to do something else, which is basically adopt the current platform of liberal gun control groups. So that is extensive regulations, and I'll talk more about what these are on the neg, but things like increased background checks and allowing people to legally own guns, but making sure that they don't get into the hands of criminals and the mentally ill. So you have to win in order to have a viable chance of affirming that a ban is better than these options. So regulations won't be able to prevent people with clean records from getting guns. So a good example is Dylan Roof had a minor drug conviction, but most people think that the gun was still legally purchased. So people who don't have a history of crime can still buy guns and still commit mass atrocities. Another problem that happens when you only have regulations is straw purchasing. So the analogy commonly given is an 18-year-old can ask a 21-year-old to buy them a beer, and likewise, a criminal can ask someone with a clean record to also buy guns. In fact, there have been reports that a lot of gangs, like the gang that was recently involved in the Waco, Texas shootout, will have their clean members that join the gang buy guns for everyone else, and that's a condition for joining the gang. A final problem is that there are some bad apple gun dealers, and these are basically just dealers that try to break the rules and don't care about federal regulations. So, for example, there's a gun shop outside of Chicago that's famous for this. It's called Chuck's Gun Shop, and hundreds and hundreds of guns found at crime scenes have been traced back to this particular store. So, even though we might have laws, it's very easy to get around those laws unless there's an outright ban, because then there's no questions asked. The final thing to discuss in the AF is some potential plans. I think the only true topical AF would be something that banned all handguns, because the topic is worded in a very broad, holistic way, and I think this is sort of the argument that people would make on the old topic for why you had to defend a living wage in hypothetical governments as opposed to particular countries. But if you want to make particular arguments specific to certain types of guns or certain types of bans, some plans to think about are first a handgun ban for a particular type of person. So, for example, stalking misdemeanors, those people often can still legally purchase a gun even though stalking is connected to murders later on. So you could defend a handgun ban for that specific person. You could also defend handgun bans in particular places. So Washington, D.C. used to have a handgun ban. I don't think this is a really smart idea because it's very easy to transport guns along common lines and or along state lines. And this is often what happens in the status quo, where most guns are bought in these states without sensible gun laws and then transported to states with harsher gun laws like New York or California. Finally, you could defend a ban on a particular type of handgun. So one of the issues with the weapon that Dylan Roof used in the Charleston shooting was that it was a semi-automatic handgun. So the problem with that is that it means you can shoot more people quickly because it takes less time to reload. I don't think that would be a particularly smart plan either, because assault weapons actually do have the same problem and have the same advantage. But I think if you wanted to narrow your ground in some way, bans on a particular type of person would be the way to go. Then on the negative. So what should a smart negative defend? I think in most cases, unless this would contradict an argument you're making, you should try to defend everything short of a ban. So that means things like universal background checks. So anytime at a gun show or between private sales or online, the same background check that occurs at a gun dealer has to happen here. There's also evidence suggesting that requiring a permit to purchase a handgun is also incredibly ineffective. So this involves things like a 2-month training period, like in New Jersey, or having to like go through training through a criminal background check, etc., to make sure you can legally own a handgun. A recent report by someone with the last name of Webster found that in Connecticut, when Connecticut enacted this law in 1995, the gun deaths immediately dropped following this law. And when Missouri repealed one of these laws, the gun deaths immediately increased. So they have been shown to be incredibly effective in reducing gun violence. You could also defend things like expanded categories for prohibited purchasers. So that's the people that we think probably shouldn't be able to own guns, like people on the terror watch list, making sure that they can't buy guns. And then another thing you can do, which was just recently passed in California, is gun violence restraining orders. And what these do is they allow family members or close people to a person, if they think that person is dangerous, they can go to a court and have a court issue a gun violence restraining order so that person's guns are temporarily confiscated. Some people say this would have been able to prevent the Charleston shooting because Dylan Roof's parents noticed that he was having problems and was unstable in some way. I'm unsure how true that actually is, but it's something worth exploring. Then arguments for the negative. So the first could be the idea of self-defense, or the more guns, less crime. A researcher named John Lott made this theory popular. There have been a lot of problems cited with the Lott study, like the evidence isn't as reliable or legitimate as he claims it to be. But the basic idea is if people have guns, they can defend themselves against other criminals, and it also creates a deterrent effect because you're less likely to try to rob someone on the street if it's possible that they might have a gun. Another position to take is a more libertarian or philosophical approach. So the way the argument is usually structured is the idea that guns are a check against government tyranny. And I think that's kind of silly. Like, this is the idea that, like, Obama's going to invade people and take all their guns, which isn't the right way to make the argument. But there is probably something slightly intuitive to the idea that it's bad that if only the police and the military are the people with weapons capable of killing mass amounts of people. And the way to balance the scale is to give people the ability to access a gun so long as they're capable of following the rules and only using that gun in situations where it's necessary. A third argument could be a constitutional neg. I don't think this is the greatest argument, but it's just the idea that the U.S. should do what's ever constitutional, and in D.C. v. Heller, the Supreme Court clearly stated that handgun bans were unconstitutional. They did say that regulations were permissible, but that people have a right to own some kind of handgun. And so you can make that argument. The way to approach that on the AF is to just recognize that Supreme Court precedent isn't everything in determining constitutionality. Like, the reason why the Supreme Court can overturn cases is if there's a constitutional reason to do so. So just keep that in mind. Another argument you can make that I think is probably better than the other ones is a race argument. So recently on Salon, Gorovich posted an article about the liberal argument against gun control, and he said that similar to enforcement of drug laws, gun bans and gun control measures will probably be enforced more harshly in inner-city environments and not in rural environments, which means that people often of color are likely to be the ones that experience these laws and experience the punishment for these laws compared to others. So an example of this is like in New York City, police tactics did do a good job of decreasing gun crime and increasing the penalty for gun ownership, but that was mainly through tactics like stop and frisk, where people of color were disproportionately burdened by those measures. And unlike current gun laws, like background checks that try to prevent people from getting access to guns, a ban would also probably cause more arrests and more harsh sentences and fuel the prison industrial complex, because now if you're found with any type of gun, you're likely to be arrested, as opposed to just having a gun denied to you when you tried to buy it. The last argument to consider that I think will be common is a politics disad. So normally I think these are kind of silly, but if there's a case where it applies, it's definitely on this topic. Gun control has been considered the third rail of American politics following the 1994 midterms. There's also the case to be made that Part of the reason why Senate Democrats lost so badly in 2014 is because of the gun control measures that Obama tried to push in 2013. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, is considered one of the most powerful lobbying groups in Washington, and Republicans are terrified of it, and even more conservative Democrats are also concerned. For good answers to the political power of the NRA, though, you can check a report from the Center for American Progress, where they looked at how the NRA tried to influence elections, and they found out that its win percentage in the 2012 elections was actually incredibly low, and so a lot of the money it spent on elections didn't help it get the desires it actually wanted, and that report can help give good answers to that. So that's mainly what I have for a brief introduction to the topic. You can definitely email me at duboisd@gmail.com if you have more questions, and as you do your own research, you'll find more ideas, but hopefully that gives you a good indication of where gun laws are to start. So I hope you have a great time at UNT, and thank you for listening to this video.